Welcome to Website Design Basic CSS. My name is Sean, and today we're going to be working with cascading style sheets. This class is intended to be introductory and is informed by my experience working as a web designer for the Bloomingdale Public Library for over 20 years. I also based a good deal of the structure of the class on tutorials provided by LinkedIn Learning, a service available to cardholders through our library's website and that I would highly recommend to anyone looking to learn more about this topic. With that, let's take a look at today's class goals. First off, we want to gain an understanding of what CSS is and what it's for. We want to learn how to incorporate CSS into our HTML web pages. We want to thoroughly explore CSS syntax. And we want to understand the basics of spacing and layout control using CSS. So what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. We will refer to it as CSS for ease of speech for the rest of the class, but the Cascading Style Sheets indicates how the controls go down level to level and can overwrite each other as they go through. We'll talk about that more later on in the class. CSS controls the presentation of the web. So if you think of HTML as the structure or the content of your web page, CSS is the presentation or style of it. CSS is also a style sheet language that differentiates it from things like Java, which are scripting languages or what we might think of as actual programming, or HTML, which is a markup language where you have the content surrounded by tags that change the appearance and behavior of it based on the website. With CSS, we're going to be changing the way these styles are approached page to page and by the browser when it interprets the information. How do we use this? There are three different ways we can incorporate CSS into our HTML pages. The first is inline styles. That's placed within an HTML tag to affect specific bits of content. You can see an example here. I was changing an H1 header to have its style be colored red. This is not recommended. There are times when it's appropriate when you need to have just one thing that is different from everything else on the page, but generally speaking, there are a lot of downsides for this. For one, it's labor intensive. You have to go through and make this change every time you want something to be different, every bit of content or tag that you use. So that's a lot of initial work and kind of defeats the purpose of using the style sheets. Another reason that this isn't recommended is it's very hard to change later on. It can be hard to find for people that are coming along and changing your code later on, even if you're the one that's coming back and changing it later on. And it can be hard to actually do the physical changes because you might have to make a lot of values be different from place to place and page to page. So much more efficient to do it in mass in one of the two ways that we're going to talk about next. The first of those are style blocks. These are defined in the header of a web page, and this is a much more common choice than the inline styles. This will affect all the content throughout the page. For example, in the header you might have the paragraph tag listed, and within these curly brackets that we're going to see over and over again, you will see the declaration statement. We're going to learn more about those in just a few moments, saying that the color of text in a paragraph is red. You can have a lot of attributes of these elements changed at the top, and you can have multiple ones of these element statements. So you can see a lot of content right at the top of the page. This can be very effective and a nice way to change the appearance of your entire web page. The only downside of it is that it only affects the page that you're on. And so if you want to have something that's more broad and affects your entire website at once, you would want to use external style sheets. Generally speaking, these are the most efficient choice. What you're doing with external style sheets is you are creating an entirely separate file from your HTML file. As you will see down here in my example, this file will be named something.css. I use the name styles.css, which is a very common choice, but it is not required. You can name it whatever is appropriate for your information. You can in fact have multiple pages within one web sheet, or one website I should say. So you can have several different style sheets to use in different pages or to overlay each other when you have different elements that you want to change. We'll start out with the basics and just putting in one or two things in, but you can let this grow and you can go back to and just change one page and have it affect your entire site at once. So this is the most efficient choice, but just like we talked about with the other ones, there are times when you want to have more granular control and you want to change things either within one individual page or sometimes even within one individual tag. So you'd use these style blocks and inline styles respectively for those situations. Finally, let's talk about why we use CSS before we get into the nitty-gritty of talking about the syntax and doing examples of changing this. So why are we learning this? What's the value of it? First off, it allows us to separate style from structure. This allows changes to be easily made when you come back to this. What we mean by that is we have, as we talked about before, the structure of the HTML. When you overlay that with the CSS styling, you can go back and make massive changes to your website without having to change all of the content and structure that you've built in. For those of you who have been involved with an organization for a while, you may have gone through multiple web pages or websites over the years. Somebody comes along and decides that things should look different, or your style becomes dated and you want to update it. And very often people go through and recreate the entire web page. When you use CSS, you can avoid all that work by having the layer of CSS on top of it and making the changes to that while keeping the basic structure of your website the same in most situations. So that can be a big time saver. It's also good for smaller changes. Say you have just a theming or color branding change with your organization. You can then apply that to the entire website very quickly without having to go through and change a lot of different elements. Another thing that I really like about using CSS is that it allows division of labor within an organization. Let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes you have a lot of information in your website and you want to divide up who handles that based on what they know about. So if they work in different departments or if they have expertise in different elements of your business, you might want to have them working on putting the information into different web pages. When parts or jobs available change, you can have them go through and update that. But getting into the details of the layout and the appearance of it might be a bit beyond their abilities with web editing. So you can yourself control the CSS that will control all of the appearance of the website and just let other people come in and change the text and the markup language around it so that they can change the content of the web page without having to worry about how to control the appearance. This way you can have people take care of what they know about and you can handle the wider controls that go along with the website. Another plus of using CSS is, as we've mentioned a couple of times, controlling the styles for the entire website from one place. Can't tell you how big a time saver this is, and also the benefits of keeping your entire website look consistent throughout. It can be very difficult to go page by page and make the changes that are needed to handle an update or to make sure that everything looks the same. And you always want to have a consistent look to your website when possible because it gives people the impression that they're within the same place and it looks much more professional. Finally, this is a little bit beyond the scope of today's class, but you can use CSS to tailor the style of your website to the viewing device. So you can have things change based on the size of the device that people are looking at. And so if they come with a smartphone or a tablet to your website, the appearance and the layout of it can be changed. As I said, that's a little bit beyond the scope of today's class. We're just learning the basics today, but that is a benefit of working with CSS. And with that, we're going to get started with learning about the syntax. When we're talking about syntax in the terms of a programming language, we are talking about essentially the grammar of the language. This is how do we write it? How do we arrange the values and the words that we're typing in so that it actually works and is interpreted correctly with the browser? And you can see in the example that I gave here, we're talking about the syntax with CSS being relatively straightforward. There are two things to it. There's a selector and then a declaration block. The selector, as you can see, I color-coded these here so that we can look at the example and see how it matches up. The selector is the element that you want to style. In this example, a div tag. The declaration block are the changes that you want to make. In this example, I am making the color red and the font size 14. A declaration block includes one or more declarations. I keep all of my examples in these classes relatively straightforward, but you can have a lot of values change within a declaration block if you are so inclined. Most of the time, though, we only have one or two things that we want to change, in my experience. We're keeping things relatively simple. This isn't the case quite so much when you're working with layouts and spacing, as we will talk about later in the class. Declaration rules are separated into two parts. The property, as you can see I made that bold, and the properties down here are bold, and the value. So the property is color, and the value is red. Or the property is font size, and the value is 14. The property and the value are separated by a colon, and each declaration ends with a semicolon. You can see the colon there and the semicolon. The space is optional. I'll explain about that in just a moment. as are the end lines that we have at the end there. The curly brackets are what we use to contain all of our declaration blocks. We will see these at any time other than with the inline styles. That's something else entirely. Now, you might be wondering, where did you get these names? Where did you get these properties that you put in? How do you know what values are okay? That's a big question. That, as I mentioned before, the syntax is relatively straightforward for CSS, but there are a lot of details available. There are a lot of selectors that you can work with, and there are a lot of properties that you can change and values you can have in there. This is not the sort of thing that we memorize. If you have a nice HTML editor installed on your computer, that may fill in a lot of the blanks for you as you start to type these things in. It might start suggesting options that you can change. And that's a nice time saver, and it makes it easier to remember things, but it's not necessary. So if you're concerned, thinking, I don't have that, I'm just using Notepad on my computer to make these changes, that's okay. There are a lot of online resources that you can go to look these things up. I've been working with CSS pages for a long time now, and I still go and check these pretty often because you don't necessarily remember all of the details, and you want to make sure you get it right. I recommended a couple of my favorites here. W3 Schools is a great resource for people that want to learn more about website development, and their CSS reference is excellent. The Mozilla developer site also has a lot of great information too. Now, you could find any number of web pages just like this by going to Google and searching for CSS syntax, CSS selectors, CSS properties, CSS values, and there'll be a lot of results for that. But these are a couple that I particularly like, so feel free to check those out. Some more information about the syntax. Spacing inside of blocks doesn't matter, it's just used for clarity. What that means is that you can have multiple lines like I did here, or you can have things all in one line. Either way works just fine. It's entirely up to you. I would recommend, though, whenever it's possible, if your web page isn't too long already and getting to be hard to read because of the size of it, some blank lines and some spacing can make things a lot easier. Very often we make these changes and we come back much, much later, and it can be confusing keeping track of what you did or where you found things. Readability is a very nice virtue to have for web pages. Next, I mentioned grouping. You can group multiple selectors together if you share the same declarations. So say you're changing the font size for a number of selectors on your web page, in this example the paragraph tag and the header 6 tag. If you're changing them to the same thing, then you could group them together, separated only by a comma, and only have to type that once. A nice time saver, and it can make it easier to make changes if you decide to come back later on and change the value of this. Next, I mentioned comments. Comments are great in any kind of programming. I strongly recommend them. Comments explain what's going on. They help you when you come back to make changes later on. They help somebody else that comes along and wants to make changes to something. Very valuable. Just recently had to do a large website change because we upgraded our catalog here at the library, and I went back to code that I had written years ago, and it took me quite some time figuring out what I was doing because I did not comment it properly. This is something that can't recommend enough. So what you do with the comments is you have a /, then an asterisk, and then all the comment contained within. This can be multiple lines. I have it all one line here, but if this was a paragraph worth of information, that's okay, it still works. Then at the end you have an asterisk and a slash. Make sure that you have that in there. If you don't close out your comments, everything after it will just be read as a comment by the browser, and so none of that CSS will work. So if you're trying to figure out why a bunch of your changes didn't happen, go back and make sure your comments are properly opened and closed. In my example, you can see I explained this is where I format my page titles, and then I have the header 3 with a couple of formatting changes, making the font size 12 and the color blue, presuming that I'm using header 3 throughout my pages for the page titles. I mentioned some additional syntax rules here at the end. These are a little bit beyond the scope of today's class, but I will mention very quickly, inline style rules are when you are putting something within a tag of an HTML page. Again, I don't recommend that, but if you do that, you need to know that you write that slightly differently than you write all the other forms of CSS. And shorthand is a technique that you can do to combine different property values when you have something that is more complex. Say when you're creating border sizes and you need to have a top border, bottom, left, and right, you can squeeze all of those values into one line if they are consistent. So there are some little tricks involving shorthand that save you time with how you would write these things out. They are not necessary, you don't need to learn them, but as you get more comfortable with CSS, you might start using them. The only downside is they can be a little confusing if people are coming along. It's not as obvious what you are changing. So I am hesitant to use that, but if this is your own work and you're the only one dealing with it and you understand it well, the shorthand might be a nice time saver for you. Let's talk a little bit about the CSS selectors that are available. There are 4 selectors: the element selector, the class, the ID, and the descendant selector. We're going to talk about all of them in detail, starting with the elements. Element selectors are global. They affect every element of that type in a style document. Some examples of these are the paragraph, the header tags, the unordered list, etc., ordered lists, anchor tags, all the tags that we are familiar with from writing HTML. So all those things you put within the less than and greater than signs, those are tags that you can change using the element selectors. I find this to be the most intuitive part of CSS. The idea that we know how paragraphs behave, they normally space things out in a certain way, they lay out in a certain way, but we can go and change that a little using our style sheets. Whether we're changing the spacing of them, as we'll learn about more when we talk about our layout controls in just a few moments, or we're changing the specific elements like the font color, the font size, the background color. All of these things are things that we can change by using the element selector, as you see in my example here. So a very useful place to start, and a thing that I think that you will use frequently once you get comfortable working with CSS. Now the class selector is something of a next step when working with CSS. I find this to be a very valuable tool. It's less broad than the element selectors. It allows you to set up a group of changes but only have them apply when you want to. Now you create the classes yourself. You can name them whatever you want and use them as often as you need within your document. They can in fact even be used within different elements. So when you create a class, you can apply that class to paragraphs. You can also apply it to divs or to headers, whatever is appropriate. I also want you to note in this example that classes have a period before their name, which indicates to the CSS that you are creating a class. You can see in this example I showed both the HTML and the CSS. In the HTML, you see that the paragraph tag has within it an attribute named class, and I said that equals error. You will notice that this is a relatively well-named class because this explains what it is we are changing. We're going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes when we talk about working with styles and how we make that play nicely with our HTML. Within this tag it says invalid email address entered. And you can see in the CSS I created a line dot error, so instead of just having the P like we had back there, we have dot error, and inside the brackets I have changed the property value of color to red. So normal paragraphs would go on as they normally would, but when you put this class in, it changes the text to be red. So this allows you to apply these changes whenever is appropriate. Again, I find this to be a very useful tool when working with CSS, particularly when you get into working with the layouts. If you have different kinds of divs or sections of your web page and you want them to be spaced or sized differently, applying the appropriate classes is a huge time saver, works really well. Similar to classes, or the class selectors, we have the ID selector. The main difference is that they need to be unique, so you can only use this once. Another important difference with them is that they have higher priority. They override class-based styles. We're going to talk about inheritance when we're talking about some of the main concepts of CSS in just a few minutes, but keep in mind that the IDs override the class-based styles. So if you have a conflict between the two of them within your document, the ID will take precedence. And then finally, note that when you are creating this in the CSS, the pound symbol is what indicates an ID as opposed to the period before it when we were working with the class selectors just a moment ago. You can see here in the HTML, I have div and then it says ID equals content. I might note that this is a less well-named ID tag than the one that I had before, because content doesn't really tell me very much about what it's about, whereas the error indicates something went wrong. But this would change this text to be green because in the CSS I have hashtag content and I changed the color to be green. A little note here, you can make the selectors element specific using classes or IDs. So in the CSS, you could say that within header 1, the class page title makes the font size 28 pixels. Then you could have another line saying within paragraph, the page title makes the font size 14 pixels. You can make these classes or these IDs specific and different from one element selector to another. That is if you're getting very fine control over when you are using one thing and when you are using the other. I would again be cautious about that because that can create confusion as to what they're doing, and so you need to very clearly comment or just have a really strong understanding of how you have this laid out, but it is an option that's available to you. Finally, we have the descendant selector. This targets elements based on their location within other elements. So you can see in this example here, we have the anchor tag within a paragraph tag within a div. Excuse the typo there, that letter A should be an arrow pointing that this is the CSS code that we are using here. There's a little translation into my slide that went wrong. But inside of this makes any anchors that are inside of paragraphs that are inside of divs blue. You see this example is a little bit extra specific and maybe a little bit silly. We might want to have, for example, the anchors behave differently within ordered lists than they behave within paragraphs. And so in that situation, you might want to just have an anchor within a paragraph as a CSS element and then an anchor within an ordered list within a CSS element if you wanted to have links treated differently when they're part of a bulleted list on your web page. In the style guides that I've seen, they recommend not having more than 3 of these. I find even 3 to be a little bit confusing and a little bit excessive. Usually having this within one tag is choice enough. I have used this as a learning tool, and when playing with it, I've never actually had cause to use it within a design element. I think that you are, again, treading on a little bit too confusing for its own good territory when you are working with descendant selectors. A couple of other ideas that I want to get across before we get into some of the last key concepts. When you're getting the CSS and the HTML to work better together, you want to make sure that you use meaningful names for the classes and IDs. I referenced this a little bit earlier, but if you are looking through your HTML and you see classes listed there, class values or ID values, you can name these whatever you want. You are creating these when you are creating them in the CSS. Create them in a way that will indicate to anybody looking at the HTML, including you, what this is supposed to do. Indicate that this is what comes up when there's an error, or this is what you use for your titles, or this is what you use for quotes, or whatever is appropriate for the content. And then I mentioned be consistent with the elements, classes, and IDs used. There are a lot of different ways that you can handle this. You've seen some of these in examples, whether you do things within div tags, or do things within paragraphs, or how you handle lists, or what kinds of classes or IDs you can create. You can have a lot of options. This gets confusing across multiple web pages. So decide how you want to do this and do it consistently across your pages. Now let's talk about some of the key ideas that we're going to use when working with our website. Now that we're comfortable with the details of the syntax, I want to talk about some last key ideas. Some of these are just concepts that I want to make sure that you're a little bit familiar with, and others are particularly things that we want to use frequently when we're working with CSS. So I want to go through some of these and show them to you. We're going to start out with inheritance. Inheritance is talking about which applied CSS property takes precedence over the other ones. So if you have conflicting declaration statements or declaration blocks, which ones are going to be the ones that actually show up in your browser. For this, a very basic way to think of it is the last style applied always wins. So if you have an included file and then something else is listed later on, that one is the one that's going to take precedence. If you have a number of attributes changed, the last one put in is the one that is going to appear on the screen. For this, we can see that included files are less effective than header-defined values, which are less effective than inline values. That doesn't mean that inline values are the better way to go. I still recommend using the other ones first because they are going to be more efficient and less mistake-prone ways to make changes to your website. But if you think about this, it does make sense because the last thing that you would put in would be the inline value, so that would be the one that you would want to be different from everything else. So having that be the one that takes precedence works well for design purposes. When we talk about child values overruling the parent value, That's when you sometimes have one tag that is inside of another tag. The tag on the inside is the one that has the largest effect. We've already seen this in just normal HTML coding. When you have inside of a paragraph, you have an anchor tag for, say, a link that you've created. That one looks different than the rest of the paragraph because that is the child on the inside. That is the last effect applied. So we see the same thing there. Related to this, I talk about browser defaults and CSS normalization. Every browser has its own default way of displaying HTML tags, its own built-in CSS, you might say. For the most part, they're consistent, but there are little differences here and there. And every now and then, that can be a problem. If you ever looked at a web page in Chrome and then looked at it in Firefox and it looked different from one to the other, that's an example of browser defaults having an effect. To counter that, you can include CSS normalization files. There are a number of these available on the web. Preferences change from one to the other for what people want to do, but what they will do is they will put in a CSS value that is just making things consistent for all browsers right at the top of your web document. And then after that, you can put in your own files to change things the way that you want them to be specifically for this website. So it's just a way of normalizing things across all the browsers before you get going. It is not something that I always do, but if you're seeing problems with your web page where there are things that are jumping around or not consistent from browser to browser, you might want to consider using that. Next, I want to talk about the fonts. Inside the fonts, we have a number of basic properties: the font family, the font weight, the font style, and the font size. This does not include, by the way, the color. We've talked about that already. That's simply labeled color as a property within any of these attributes, but the font values have the little dash in the middle there. That's why we separate those out. These are things that we change a lot when working with CSS. The way the text looks is very important for how our pages look, and so I wanted to make sure that we were aware of that. Inside the font family, we can specify the font for an element. We have a prioritized list of fonts, so if the first one isn't available, it goes to the next one and so on down. And that it includes a fallback font, so you have a final choice at the end if that prioritized list didn't work. I have an example of that here. The font weight is where we decide the thickness or boldness of our font. So that's, sometimes we might think of that as style, but that is separated out into weight within the web pages, different than how it is handled in, say, Microsoft Word. The font style has normal, italic, and oblique. By the way, for both the weight and the style, not all of these options that we have available are available for every font family. So there are some fonts that can't be done bold or can't be done in italicized, so just be aware of that. And then finally, font size. We've seen examples of that a number of times already throughout this class. I have some web resources listed here. It says web safe fonts. You can find a listing of those at the W3 schools and among a number of other places. And I mentioned here at the bottom, although this is a little bit beyond the scope of today's class, you can import fonts using either the font face value or the import tag within your CSS to pull in web resources if you have specific fonts that either you've created or that you're using based off the web. That's, again, getting a little bit beyond the basics of design for today, but be aware that that is an option available for you. I want to talk about the box model. I have a very crude version of it drawn here on the screen, but this is a very common layout on the web. This is something that we use CSS to do to create rules surrounding the physical properties of all of our HTML elements. We're going to look at the details of these properties that we can change in just a moment, but I wanted to show you just an example of what you're going for. So if you wanted to have, say, a directory on the side, a header, and then some content underneath, this would be an example of the box model, and we're going to come back to this as we look at some of these properties that we can change. So I'm going to jump back and forth between slides to show you what we're talking about here as we go. So, margins, paddings, and borders. So we're familiar, of course, with including images or paragraphs or things like that into our web page, and within those we see the actual content that we have. We see the picture, we see the text that's in there, we see the list that we throw in or the link or all of those things. But we might have noticed when we're putting this information into our web page, there's space around it. It doesn't quite smush up against the other stuff that we have there. That's because of the margins, padding, and borders. Margins are the space outside an element that relates to how it fits with the other elements. So if I go back to our previous page, that would be this white space between here, and that is something that you can control. You can adjust the margins on the top, left, right, and bottom of each element that you put in. The border is the border that goes around the object. If you've ever worked with things like tables, you might be familiar with borders when we put them in there. All elements have the option of a border, but most of them don't have one by default. You can put in the border width or the border style or the border color as a way of controlling how thick it is, whether it looks dashed or solid, and what color it appears. You can see here the borders going around these elements as we go through that. And then finally, the padding is space added between the content and the border within an element. So if you have a text chunk in there, you might not want to have the text going right up to the border. You might want to have a little padding built in. Most elements have a small amount of padding by default. You can adjust that if you're trying to squeeze things in and find space there. So that would be back here if this was text and there was a sort of an inner square where the text was appearing, and then a little space between that inner square and the border. Finally, I want to talk about the content width and height. When we are setting the width and height for things, we can set them for specific pixels or percentage of the screen. Be aware that when you're setting the width and height for something, that does not include the other elements that we have just talked about here. So the actual total element width is the left border plus the left padding plus the actual contents width plus the right border plus the right padding. So we have to plan all of those things out when you're figuring out how wide something is going to be. So this is something that can cause problems. If you set something to be 100% width, but then it has padding or a border or margin width to it, it can then be larger than the space that it is allotted for. So be very cautious about that when you're going through these things. I do want to talk about backgrounds and color. You can have backgrounds for just about all of the elements that you put in. The default background is transparent, but you can put in, if you like, solid colors, gradients, or images. When you're using the images, you can control the position, whether it repeats, and the size. Generally speaking, we don't recommend using images too often. That can be very cluttering on a background for a page, but sometimes people will create just a stylized gradient or something like that they like to use, and they'll have it repeat over and over again and use that as a background image. That can be subtle and can work well with the background content, but actual discernible pictures, generally not a great idea. Colors can, when you are selecting colors, they can be indicated in a number of ways. There are keywords that you can use, things like that you've seen me use throughout the class today, blue, red, yellow, basic colors like that. Hexadecimal notation, which are 6-digit numbers where each digit is from 0 to F, indicating the degree of color that is valued in there. RGB values, and HSL. RGB stands for red, green, blue, where you would have a mix of those. Those are 3-digit values. And HSL, which are hue, saturation, and lightness. If you look at any guides for this, whether at W3 Schools or anywhere else on the web, you'll see a lot of values listed and provided. I would recommend sticking with keywords for just basic colors, things like fonts or borders that you want to have in, and working with hexadecimal notation for more varied colors that you want to include. That gives you fine control, and it also works well with just about every tag and property that you would work with. Finally, I want to talk about measurement, how we define the size of things on our website. These are used across a number of properties, whether you're talking about how many pixels wide the element of a table should be or a div should be, or whether you're talking about the size of your font, size of images that you include. We use different kinds of measurements frequently. The most common one to use is px. That is indicating the number of pixels. If you're not familiar with pixels, those are the little dots that make up your screen. So the more resolution you have, the more pixels that you can have. So this is not necessarily a fixed size in inches, but this is determining how many of the little dots on the screen will be used for anybody's web viewing. Best way to understand how this will look is through trial and error and increase and decrease them. So these are absolute values. They are fixed, but they will differ depending on how people have things set on their own screen. So if they have a higher resolution screen, they will see more pixels available to them. The EM value is a relative value. This is done relative to the parent elements. This works very well for accessibility. So if you have, say in this example, the body font size is set to 100% of the default, which depending on the browser, it might be set anywhere from 8 if people like their font size to be small so they can see a lot, or if they have visual issues, they might have it as big as 16, 18, 20, so they might have much bigger text. So if you want your header to look much bigger than the normal font, no matter how big people have it set, you can set the relative value to 4 EM. Now in this example, 4EM would be 400% the default size. So that would be very, very large text. You can see the danger with that of having things be relative. If people make everything big because they have trouble seeing, then all of a sudden your relative size can be enormous. So be careful with that. REM is also relative, but it's relative to the root element, not to the base size. So that would be relative to how the headers are by default supposed to be sized rather than relative to the body. Finally, we have percentage. That's used typically on layouts, not for things like font or image sizing. So that controls the amount of space available with the tag and how much of it you actually want to use. Again, be wary of this because you have to keep in mind things like borders and padding. With that, I hope you enjoyed our class on working with the basics of CSS. If this is something you'd like to learn more about, please let me know. You can go to our forum at the computer classes. This is a topic that I enjoy talking about with you, and I would love to have more classes on it if we wanted to get more in depth with this. So let us know what you want to see or what you liked and didn't like, and we'll be happy to add more of that. Thank you again, and have a great day.